Welcome to Compeer's Ag Edge, brought to you by Compeer Financial. In each episode, we break down complex agricultural economics, policy dynamics, and farm business topics into conversations that make sense for your operation. We're here to help you stay informed and confident about the trends and decisions affecting your agricultural business. I'm Megan Roberts, agricultural economist at Compeer Financial, and today we're talking about something that impacts every agricultural operation, regardless of size, commodity, geography. It's risk. But the conversation goes beyond grain markets and weather forecasts. Today we're looking at operational resiliency as a whole and what it means to prepare your farm business for disruption before the disruption happens. That's where Farm Risk Ready comes in. Joining me today is Erin Cummings, a senior consultant on the sponsor relations team at Nationwide, who's helping lead Nationwide's Farm Risk Ready initiative, a program designed to help producers evaluate risk, improve preparedness, and build customized resiliency plans for their operations. Erin, thanks for joining us today.
Well, hey, Megan, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. So, as you mentioned, I'm Erin Cummings, and I'm on the sponsor relations team at Nationwide, where I build relationships with ag organizations across the country. Part of my role is also to be very involved in all of Nationwide's initiatives in the farm space, including Farm Risk Ready. Outside of my role at Nationwide, my husband and I operate a diverse farm operation in central Iowa. We have a full service automotive repair business that we operate, and we do some grain hauling, all while raising our 14-year-old daughter on our fourth generation farm.
A lot going on. I feel like we could have a conversation about farming, off-farm jobs, raising kids, the whole nine yards. So let's talk a little bit more about risk. I think historically, when we talk about risk management in agriculture, it's really around markets, crop insurance, weather. And as an ag economist, I get that. That is the pressing risks for most farmers on a regular basis. But risk landscape today looks very different, particularly in 2026. I've been thinking a lot about geopolitical risks and just how that's affecting our agricultural economy and affecting farm gate decisions right now. So, as that as a lead in, what's your perspective on what's changed regarding farm risk?
Yeah, well, Megan, you said it really well. Now there's more risk than ever. Geopolitical risk is rising to the top of something that we're all thinking about, where maybe 10 years ago that really wasn't on our radar. And we're so interconnected as a world with inputs and outputs that has a big impact on what we do every day on the farm. So risk is evolving every day and every year, and farmers are facing more risk than ever before. Those evolving dynamics of a global marketplace in agriculture are really creating new risks. But the traditional risks of how do you put a crop in the ground, how to get a crop out, how to raise livestock, they really haven't changed. But what we found is that today's risks extend far beyond just the field, and they've outpaced the pace of resiliency planning. So now with all these risks that our farmers are facing, resiliency planning really is no longer optional. We've seen it across the country, a farmer's ability to anticipate, adapt, and then recover from the unexpectedly, quickly, and effectively really sets apart the good, the better, and the best operations. And as we see these risks facing the farmers, there's so much opportunity to be prepared to become that farmer of the future and have an operation that lasts generations. So, a little bit of background here is that Nationwide conducted a study with another farm credit organization to really think about the future state of risk. What's all the risk that a farmer is facing? And it was a little alarming because, of course, the study put out a huge list of risks that was a little scary at first. So we took that list and actually pressure tested it with a focus group. And we all looked at this list and thought, yes, it's overwhelming. But at the same time, it felt kind of good just to get it out, to acknowledge that, yes, we are facing a lot of risk in the ag industry, and that continues to evolve. So then our conversation quickly turned to, well, what can we do about it? And if I think about that big list of risks, they all kind of fit into separate categories. And some of those categories were very predictable, like production. Like I mentioned, getting a crop in and out animal production, the risks that are just associated to the production and the operation. Some risks that we probably don't think about a lot are around growth risks. Do we want to grow our existing operation? Do we want to add a new revenue stream? Do we want to discontinue a revenue stream? That growth risk brings individual unique challenges. You kicked off our conversation with a comment about, risk management. We think about price and market risk. So that definitely still exists. And in this global marketplace, there's way more external factors that could set us back than in the past. The other thing that we're seeing emerging is more digital risk. We rely on so much data in our operations and collect so much data. There's some digital risk there. Also, all of our equipment is equipped with some pretty complex tech. So that risk has grown and changed. The other thing is institutional and regulatory risk. And this really showed up in the survey in our surveyors from the East and the West. So in the East and the West, we're talking about regulations, a lot around water. So thinking through how that could impact an operation. There's also adoption risks. Just as I mentioned, there's so much tech available. There's a risk in adopting, there's a risk in not adopting. And how is your farm going to adopt the technology? How will you deploy that technology? How will you use it? Risks that kind of come along with these decisions that we might not think about. The other risk that we're all familiar with and we talk a lot about is legacy and success risks. So, from a legacy or succession planning risk, how are we going to ensure that this operation transitions not just the land itself, but the business? How does the business move to the next generation, to another group to continue the farming operation? And that's really just listing a few of these categories. And that's where Farm Risk Ready really strives to help farmers prepare and then prevent business disruptions that come from this long list of risks and challenges that they face today.
In some ways, it's just reframing some of these topics as risks. I mean, one of the number one things that when we're talking to Compeer clients that they mention is farm succession, but it's not always in a risk context. So I just think that is such an interesting perspective of really putting that label of risk mitigation on this plethora of topics. So another thing that stood out to me in the Farm Risk Ready research was that producers felt maybe only moderately prepared for disruption. And maybe my comment that I just made about, not necessarily categorizing all of these as a risk plays into that because we're not thinking about all of them as risk. Although they also mentioned that they could handle the issues if they happened in real time, which I think is just like farmer pragmatism. Like, yeah, we can handle this. So let's get down to what that means. What do you think the gap between moderately prepared to face a risk and, yeah, I can handle this if it happens? Why do you think that gap exists?
Yeah, so I think it all relates kind of back to that wait and see approach, or I'll take care of that when it arises.
Yeah.
But if I go back to the research, and really the reason we dove into the research is try to understand how does a situation play out today, and where can we fill the gap? Where does that gap exist? So in that research study, we found that the ag industry, not surprising, is not really positioned to thrive through some of these high risk business disruption scenarios. With the research, the data that came through is that farmers express feeling only moderately prepared to manage disruptions, but also very confident that if something came up, they could just handle it at the time. So there's that kind of misalignment and that, man, I'm not ready. Oh, but I'll figure it out, which isn't a bad strategy in the moment, but not a great long-term solution. So while that was a little bit of a challenge that came out of the research, the limited adoption of actual plans. And what am I formally going to do was that common theme across farmers, with two-thirds of farmers reporting that they did not have a formal plan. So what that does, it really leaves those farms and ranches exposed should something happen. A few other cool things that came out of the research to highlight is that farmers, even though they were taking that wait and see approach and will handle it, they felt only moderately prepared to manage disruption risks with a readiness score of just 5 out of 10. So again, that wait and see approach. And I think the difference that we can call out here is wait and see will get the problem fixed, but a plan could get it fixed quicker. And that leads to less business interruption and less risk of income loss, depending on when that disruption happens. So the other thing to call out is that while we know a lot of farmers don't have a plan, the other alarming thing is that 75% of farmers were not currently implementing risk mitigation practices. So there are some things that you can do to reduce the the challenge of that risk or the potential of likelihood of that risk, but 75% of farmers were again kind of wait and see. I'll handle it. I'm not going to change my operations. We'll just see what happens. So the final thing I'd share about the research is that there were some differences regionally, but only in what risks rose to the top. There were very little differences in actual data around are farmers really prepared with risk mitigation and with resiliency plans. So we know there's a big gap that exists, and that's really why we created the Farm Risk Ready program.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the way you describe that, I think the mindset really makes sense because producers are busy managing the immediate operational demands every single day. I live on a livestock farm, and sometimes I'll text my husband during the day about, "Hey, have you thought about this?" And he's always so nice. He'll text back like, "I'm kind of busy, like keeping animals alive right now," and that's just an anecdotal of we've got sometimes bigger fish to fry, but over the long term, we do need to think about the bigger resiliency and just the cost of reacting instead of preparing, and having things in line ahead of time can really reduce the impacts to your farm operation.
Yeah, well, Megan, you hit the nail on the head. When we talk about Farm Risk Ready, we're also talking about the need for farmers and ranchers to work on their business, not just in their business, to adapt a predict and prevent mindset instead of that, oh, repair, replace, move on, and to really take proactive steps to mitigate and manage all kinds of risks. Like we talked about earlier, there's just so much risk, and I think it can be overwhelming. And that's why we're really trying to break it down into small pieces. That the first step is the most important. Take it and start thinking about your operation and think about the operation from a business mindset, not only a production mindset.
Yeah. So let's talk specifically about the Farm Risk Ready. What exactly is the program and what's the problem it's trying to solve?
Sure. So we are trying to solve that gap in preparedness. So Nationwide's Farm Risk Ready program, it's free, easy to use, that farmers can use to build a customized resiliency plan to their operation, their farm type, their regional area, their goals. And what's really cool is that there's a ton of resources available. So the first resource that I would encourage everyone to check out, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, is an interactive risk assessment. First off is trying to figure out, well, where do the risks lie in my operation? I may be really worried about disease control, but something else may pop up that, well, actually, I probably should be more worried about XYZ or maybe my feed supplier than disease control. Even though both are important, and one or the other could present more risk. There's also a plan builder. So as farmers use that assessment to kind of figure out where there are, the plan builder can help actually build out a plan with lots of learning materials and resources online. We're also looking to the future to do hands-on workshops for those producers that like to learn in an in-person environment versus online. But what we found is just simply taking the time to think about risk and think about the challenges that farm could face is really step one. And that's what a lot of these conversations are about right now. Let's talk about business resiliency. Let's talk about your business plan. Let's talk about your production. And let's have some of that conversation just get started. That's really the first step.
Yeah, you just got to get pen to paper sometimes, or in this case, I guess, hands to a keyboard.
That's right.
Uh, I think that a strength here is really just that it is beyond theory or kind of generic. It's really operationally focused. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So these resources are very customizable to the farmer's operation. One really cool thing about the assessment is it will pull out some gaps and maybe direct you on where to start. There's also a sample plan online. So it's not like we're just throwing you out there in the wild and then you're having to create something from scratch. Really creating a plan to help folks get through the planning process and think through in ways that we can make this as straightforward and easy as possible. Because in the grand scheme of things, all we're trying to do as farmers and business owners, we want to protect people, our assets, and our revenue streams, especially during these unexpected challenges. So, if we can get back to business just a little bit quicker with a few less sleepless nights, a few more headaches, or a few less headaches, a few less phone calls, like that's a win for all of us. So, if we kind of take this and maybe step back a little bit, we've boiled it down to 5 steps and have a 5 step guide online, which does a good job of kind of walking through really what does this look like. And again, thinking through how do we take this in step by step, bite sized pieces so you're not trying to boil the ocean or eat the entire elephant in one bite. So, step one is identifying risks. And we've chatted about this a little bit before, but really thinking through what risks are my operation most susceptible to? What should I be paying the most attention to? And then, based on those risks, think through what are some tactics that I can reduce that risk. I think we'll share some examples a little bit later on when we talk about production risks and maybe machinery to really think about how can we reduce the likelihood of that loss so we're not down, so we're not waiting on equipment or we're not waiting on a supplier or an output. Next, there's a portion to create a contingency plan. So, regardless of all the risk management that you put into place, maybe that incident does happen. So, with your plan, how are you going to get back to business as quick as possible with the least downtime? And then finally, with step four, communicate and train. What we found a lot in agriculture is farmers have all this info in their mind. Yep, if something happens, I'm going to do XYZ. But if you're not on the farm that day and something happens, who's going to know to do XYZ? So, how do we communicate and train and have this information accessible to others in the operation that we may need it? And then, while we hope we get all the risks out of the way and we never have to respond to a risk, we know that's probably not the case. So, step five is recover. And how do you recover quickly from that disruption? How do you get back to business and get everybody safe and working and keep your business running? The interesting thing is that farmers navigate these things every single day without even thinking. But that's actually part of the challenge because it's not documented or shared. And these risks are evolving so quickly that a risk that we may not have on our radar today could have a significant impact. So it's best to be prepared just in case.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned also, what if that risk happens when the primary decision maker is not there? And so that's a risk. Documenting what to do if farmer A isn't there and farmer B is the one that is having to work through the recovery process, et cetera. So what I really appreciate about this approach is that it breaks the risk management into those smaller chunks, rather than keeping it that big, maybe broad, overwhelming concept. So, as we think about farm risk ready and how it defines risk, what are some of those categories that producers might not realize are interconnected, and how do you approach that?
Sure. So I always like to use examples as we talk through some of these categories of risk. So I think the first one is maybe the most straightforward and easiest to use an example is thinking through like production risk. So it's a very broad category, but it could relate to disease pressure, input costs, machinery challenges, labor, water access, and that list goes on and on. So we think that farmers have a really good way of dealing with these things on a daily basis, but it's not likely documented, just like what we shared. So how
Yep.
do others in the operation know what to do? Do we have a good list of suppliers or alternate buyers in the case something happens? These risks are usually dealt with in the here and now. But with implementing some risk management strategies a little earlier on in the process, we could reduce the likelihood of that risk. And just using a very oversimplified example, let's say we expect to have a very dry fall. Drought conditions, combines are going to be running hard. We know we're going to have a dust issue, and maybe we only have one combine, and we know we have a large number of acres to harvest. Well, we know that that is one bottleneck in our harvest operations. We have one combine. It's a drought year, so we think the likelihood of fire could be higher than normal, and maybe we have a shorter window to harvest because there's weather coming, so we're going to be running longer and harder than normal. What are some simple things that we could do in the field before we go to the field that could reduce the risk of fire? Do we have a fire extinguisher on board? Do we have the extinguishing fireball handy? Are we equipped to know what to do in the case of a fire? The other thing, are we blowing off the combine every night? Or every morning before we start, probably every night with a leaf blower. Battery operated leaf blowers are super light, easy. Like, can you carry one of those around and just take that extra little bit of time to blow everything off and make sure that you start the morning with a combine without a ton of dust buildup? So some of those are pretty oversimplified as an example, but those simple actions could take the chance of fire down significantly because we all know if a fire happens in the field, yes, you're out of combine, you're probably out some production because it probably burned up around you, but you're out critical time. And in that time, you might not be able to get a rental as quickly as you want. Rentals are super expensive. It might be different than what you're used to running. Like there's all these challenges and headaches that you can't recapture. So reducing that risk or that loss in the first place, super important.
Yeah, absolutely. So, production and financial risk, it's probably the number one place where people think of when they're thinking about risk mitigation strategies. But let's turn maybe to a topic that is lower on the list: cybersecurity, digital, and technology risk. It's probably not on many producers' radar 10 years ago. It might not be on their radar right now as they're listening. But farms are really heavy technology dependent. So, how does Farm Risk Ready approach that particular risk?
Yeah, so you are right, Megan, on that. We didn't see a lot of this technology in place 15, 20 years ago, but farms depend on the technology or on the data they collect, on the data that they use, and all this technology that feeds in and out of those systems. We've heard some scary things about ransomware attacks and things that could really put an operation in harm, but also just how do you keep these tech tools running and useful, and how do you even use the data? There's just so much risk, and it goes on and on and on, where new technology always comes with challenges. Just like other risks, it's all about acknowledging that yes, there is risk, there could be a challenge, deploying what safety or risk management tactics you could before a loss happens, but then also kind of having a plan. So who are your contacts should something happen? How can you get access to information? How can you get back going as quickly as possible? And there's always things we can't predict. I think was it a couple years ago the satellites went out so we couldn't plant for a couple days? Like you just can't always predict it, but also if you have a plan on how you're going to get back to business or have a good source of contacts to get through the challenges, you'll be better ahead than if you're just in a wait and see and have to really stop operations as those tech issues get fixed.
Let's maybe wrap up with a really important, very frequently talked about topic on farms, but as I mentioned earlier, not always in like a risk mitigation. It's more about just like, what am I going to do? And it's legacy risk and succession planning. So, why is succession planning a part of resiliency planning in this approach?
Sure. So it's definitely a big part because lack of succession planning or generational planning is a risk.
Yeah.
There's a risk of doing nothing, and that's a
Hmm.
big challenge. So I think it all relates kind of that hesitation to plan for the transfer, and that may actually be the biggest risk that an operation faces. And resiliency planning can really help with that because that plan is not only beneficial to here and now, but can also preserve the future of it. So if we think about creating a farm risk ready plan to help the next generation be ready and on the same page, we can really think about what comes next. So we know that legacy risks are a very, very important category. But if we break that down just a little bit, legacy risks include the land and assets and how are we going to transition? What's the generational succession plan? Who is going to farm in the family, not in the family? The second piece of that is how is that next generation going to be prepared? Are they ready to take over the operation? And the third one that we don't often think about is what's the impact to the community? How is the community supported? How does the community reacted as we work on transitioning all this generational knowledge and the generational assets to whoever will be farming next? So if I think about it, it's really that hesitancy to have the hard conversations, to really start thinking about it. And it's always something we push out to the future. Oh, I'll worry about that later. But if we don't have a plan, it can be really hard to execute in the end. So we really think that using this framework to think about risk can help have some of those tougher conversations to maybe get it out in the open, to have those conversations now rather than to keep putting it off. And in addition to Nationwide's Farm Risk Ready program, we also love to partner with Compeer and our other farm credit partners on Land is Your Legacy. And that really supports that transition and succession planning from that business mindset and ensuring that the farm moves to that next generation or that next farmer.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for most farm families, that conversation about farm succession and estate planning and just the overall legacy is probably the hardest one for them to get started and going on. And what is challenging about that from a risk perspective is that avoiding that conversation is really increasing your operational risk long term. So I think it's such a key thing to just include it in the overall risk resiliency strategy. So, kind of moving from here are some examples to building your plan for producers who are listening today. I think we've done a good job, or you've done a good job of making this sound really important. But there's probably still like, okay, what's the tangible next steps? This is a little overwhelming. So where do we begin? What's the next step after listening to this podcast?
Sure. So starting is definitely the hardest part. So when Nationwide created the Farmers Ready program, the number one goal was to make it accessible and easy to start. Because if it's not accessible and easy to start, no one's going to jump in. And that all revolved around creating a step-by-step approach. So the best place to start is with the interactive risk assessment. That gauges your individual preparedness for disruption or readiness really to create a plan and can help pinpoint areas for improvement. That is available at nationwide.com/farm risk ready. And that's really the most important step. It's a short quiz and can kind of help guide you where you should go next. Once you complete that assessment, use that feedback to start the plan builder. You can create a very tailored farm risk ready plan for your specific operation and then use those resources online, the sample plan, the 5-step guide to really dig in and ensure that you're picking the most challenging risks that you need to address and things that could derail your operation if they aren't addressed. Since we know that everyone learns in a different format and a different style, we're also working on a short video series that helps you complete that plan as you go. And as I mentioned, we're also working for those people that like that in-person experience on some workshops, and we'll be rolling those out later this year. Those tools that are online are super helpful. That sample plan is a great resource. There's also some learning materials and other resources to really help take this one step at a time and not make this so overwhelming. Because that we know when farmers have a plan in place, they're so much better to anticipate those blind spots, plan for that risk, and also something that we probably don't talk about enough, they're able to demonstrate to their lenders, to their insurers and their partners, even their vendors for inputs and outputs, that their farm is ready for the future and would be a good farm to partner with.
So you mentioned some blind spots. What are some of those blind spots that you most typically see producers overlooking?
Yeah, well, we talked about it a little bit. I definitely think it's having tough conversations. Maybe that's around legacy risks as an example. But I think just in general, as farmers, we're so focused on day-to-day operations. It's hard to take a step back and take a look at that bigger picture. So I think that's probably the blind spot. I think again, we're so busy on working in the business, working on the business, that if we take some time to think about what are the bottlenecks to my operation, what are the bottlenecks to my revenue streams, we can really take a different approach to managing risk and really having that plan in the background and having us mentally walk through those steps really just helps us be a better business owner. And then at the end, that makes a much more resilient farm.
Yeah. So we talked about categories of risk. We talked about where to start. What does the plan then, once it's created, actually look like? What does a good plan typically look like?
Sure. Well, the cool thing and also the challenging thing is that each plan is going to look different
Yeah.
because each operation is pretty unique. The plan doesn't have to be overly formal. It doesn't have to be, multi-pages, a few bullets, a few notes in the plan can be all you need to make sure that you're addressing the risks. And that plan should have an action plan in it so that you are confident that something happens, you've done the background work to know what you're going to do to get through that scenario should it arise. It also shouldn't just be a plan that sits on the shelf. It should be something that farmers can rely on when challenges arise, but that also everyone has access to. So the communication and training is also really important when it comes to these plans. So they're all going to look different, and each operation has their own style of communication, of responding, that it really should reflect your operation and your voice.
So, what is the recommendation on how frequently farms should revisit and update these plans?
Sure. So definitely a revision or an update would be needed if a new revenue stream or operation is added or if one discontinues, because what could have been a very high risk could be eliminated because the operation doesn't exist anymore, or something that wasn't on your radar a year ago, but you're adding another revenue stream and operation, well, there's another risk that may pop to the top. So anytime you're adding or taking away an operation is definitely a great time to review a plan, but we also think a quick review, at least annually, can really help ensure that everything is in order.
Yeah, I so agree with that. Previously in my career, I worked a lot with intergenerational transition plans, and that was always our rule of thumb. It's just, at the very least, a quick look once a year is a best practice. But then anytime anything major changes, maybe you mentioned some operational changes, but also think about it from like marriage or someone has passed on, any sort of change to your ownership strategy. I think it's really important to take a look at those plans as well.
Definitely.
So we kind of hit the highlights. We've walked through the process. Brass tacks at the end here. What is one thing that, as we summarize this this learning that we've had here today, that you hope a producer walks away and does after listening? What would it be?
Yeah, so I think in this day and age, we have to acknowledge that we are facing more risk than ever. And in order for our operations to be successful, we have to really focus on the business rather than in the business. And that includes risk preparedness, disaster planning, disruption planning, all those things that are going to make us a more resilient operation. So, with all these risks facing us, our resiliency is key, not only for our own operation, but to preserve operations into the future just for the future of agriculture. So that's really, I think, the takeaway is that we owe it to ourselves and our operations to be as resilient as possible and start talking and thinking through some of these hard things that are going to be here to stay and evolving as we see those challenges coming up. And really, Nationwide is so excited to offer this accessible, practical way to jump into that because we know this is not easy. So the best place to start, get online, hop onto that risk assessment, really think about how you're managing risk today and use those resources that are available at Farm Risk Ready.
Awesome. Well, Erin, thanks so much for joining us today. Again, I'm Megan Roberts, ag economist here at Compeer Financial, and I was joined by Erin Cummings, senior consultant on the sponsor relations team at Nationwide. And I hesitate to say it's been fun because, like, this isn't maybe the
It's a
funnest
little heavy,
topic,
I guess.
but I think I learned something new. I always learn something, and I hope those that were listening learned as well. And thanks for making it an enjoyable conversation despite the very heavy topic.
That's right. I'm glad to be here. And the first step is to get started. So starting the conversation is often the hardest, but the most important. So I appreciate the conversation.
Thanks. Thank you for listening to Compeer's Ag Edge. You can follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. For more agricultural finance insights and resources, visit compeer.com. That's COMPEER.com. Until next time.